The question of the pupil. You have up to now explained in detail a number of laws, a considerable number of laws in fact, that show that man is not a machine. Gurdjieff is said to have said man is a machine entirely controlled by external forces. You have explained to us a number of laws, a considerable number of laws that show the differences between machines and organic life, and between machines and, of course, man as part of organic life. But recently I heard that there were two new scientific laws distinguishing machines from man in particular, or mammals. I think the mention was of bats, so this might prompt your memory in this area. Could you go into these for us now? The teacher replies, firstly, I always say in this situation, Gurdjieff never wrote that man is a machine. This comes from Ouspensky. And whether Gurdjieff said this to Ouspensky, or whether Gurdjieff merely replied to a question by Ouspensky, because these are different things. If Ouspensky asks the question, is man a machine, Gurdjieff has got to talk about the fact that man is a machine or man isn't a machine. And I suspect here that what Gurdjieff said was that we're going to consider man in a way analogous, we're going to study man in a way analogous to the way we would study a machine. So we're studying as if we are studying a motor car, its structure and its energies. And a machine is a complex device devised by man or made by man to perform a specific function, specific functions, and it always has an operator. So if we are studying your motor car, we're not actually studying the psychology of the driver of the motor car. We're not studying the operator of the motor car, and this is one of the major differences between the two teachings ascribed to Gurdjieff, that is the Gurdjieff tradition, the traditional teaching that is supposed to come from Gurdjieff but actually comes from Ouspensky, and what Gurdjieff actually wrote and what Gurdjieff was actually teaching. Gurdjieff was teaching about the structures and energies of man. He was studying the motor car, not the psychology of the driver. So firstly, that's the first thing. Now I have given many arguments to show that man is not a machine, that this idea man is a machine is completely and utterly untrue. So I think what you're referring to when you refer to bats comes about as a consequence of my reading this book, The Blind Watchmaker by Richard Dawkins, because I was able to obtain this book for 50p from my supermarket book exchange, and I've read a few chapters of it over a long period of time because I find it very difficult to read, because the arguments are so well, they're just not true. Simple as that. This is a very extraordinary book and full of very extraordinary arguments, but one of them prompted me to discover two other laws, scientific laws, that we could say to show that man is not a machine. And I think these are probably, is this about, we're on to law 111, something like that? No, 107, someone says. So this is probably 107, 108. So you've asked me the question, so I'll try to explain this, but there are aspects of this that even if you grasp them for a moment, they slip out of your fingers. So these are not the simple arguments that we started off with a long time ago. Now Richard Dawkins devotes a chapter to bats and how they perceive the world. And he compares them to the devices that the police use to trap speeding motorists. So the device that is used, it's a machine. So it's a device that's used to trap a speeding motorist, a radar device. So it sends out a signal, the signal bounces off the car and is received back by this device. Another second later, or a defined time later, it sends out another signal which is received back by the device, and by comparing these two things, this machine can determine how far that car has travelled in that, shall we say, 1 second. If it sends out a signal every second, it can say how far the car has travelled in 1 second. Now this device is an electronic device, it's hardwired and programmed, so automatically from that, according to the programs, it can work out how fast the car is travelling. How far does it go in 1 second? How far does it go? How many miles per hour? So this is analogous to the way Richard Dawkins says a bat orientates itself in the world, because the bats send out clicks, sounds of all different kinds, either a simple click or a rising click or a descending click. It's a language. We have a language and bats have a language, but they send out these clicks, and from the echoes they receive back from the objects around them, they can orientate themselves in the world. This is their means of perception. So this is a good analogy in many respects. But then Richard Dawkins says something very extraordinary, because he comments upon a book that someone has written, which is questioning how does the bat, in receiving these echoes from sound, how does a bat picture the world subjectively? And this gentleman who wrote the other book suggests that the bat perceives the world in a very similar way, or pictures the world or images the world in a very similar way, subjectively, to human beings. And Richard Dawkins is more or less, he says, in agreement with this. So that from a bat's echo location, echoing, sending these clicks out and the echoes from them, the bat is making subjectively a picture of the world that is more or less similar, Richard Dawkins suggests as a probability, to the way human beings perceive the world. We don't perceive the world in terms of sound, but predominantly in terms of light, and in a similar way, out of the light impacting our eyes, the retina of our eyes, we make a picture of the world, Richard Dawkins is quite happy to say. But here there are two rules, two laws, scientific laws, distinguishing machines from man and machines from bats, that is to say from mammals, I suppose, in general, perhaps from organic life in general. We need to think about this. Now the first of these is that Richard Dawkins accepts that a bat, and of course a man, has a subjectivity. That is, the bat and the man make a picture of the world, subjectively. Now first of all, this is not something that a machine does. If you take the radar device of the police that I mentioned earlier, where they are measuring the speed of your motor car, it does not make a picture of the world. It does not have a subjectivity. It's hardwired and programmed. It simply takes one echo and a second echo 1 second later and compares the two, and takes the next echo and compares that. And it does so because it's programmed and hardwired to do so. It does not have a subjectivity. It does not make a picture of the world. It does not need to. And it cannot anyway. How could it? It's absurd. So this is the first, this is, what is this, 107? law, scientific law 107, differentiating man from a machine, and differentiating certainly mammals and perhaps other classes of organic life from machines. We have a subjectivity. We make a picture of the world, and we operate according to that picture of the world, and not directly, not hardwired into the perceptions, as it were, the impulses that we receive from that world. So a machine does not have a subjectivity, it does not make a picture of the world. First law. So is that 107? Let's go to 108. And this is where it gets a bit subtle, slips through your fingers sometimes, but I think you can probably get what I'm talking about. And this is that the machine, let's take the radar device of the police. It sends out a signal, bounces off your car, back to the device. It records that time. And at 1 second later, shall we say, it sends out another signal, bounces off your car, it receives that signal, does a calculation from that. But the device, the machine, does not know that that is the same object. It just sends out a signal, receives a signal. It sends out a signal, receives a signal. It has no idea that that is the same object. It's just hardwired to do a calculation as a result of the receipt of those impulses. And that calculation manifests as miles per hour, so many miles per hour. However, if we have a subjectivity, and Richard Dawkins writes about the subjectivity of the bat. The bat sends out signals, many signals in a second, so it's very fast, but it's the same principle. But to say that the bat has a subjectivity and that the bat can make a picture of the world implies something else. It implies a concept, not a perception. Not the receipt of an impulse, but a concept. And that concept is that the object that it is bouncing its signals off is the same object each time. That is to say, the first signal bounces off the object, comes back to the bat, and the bat, the second signal bounces off the object, comes back to the bat. The bat has to have the concept, not the perception. It's not possible to have a perception of this, but it has the concept that that is the same object. And if we go to human beings, although we don't use echolocation, we use light. If I'm seated looking at a chair in front of me, every perception that I receive of that chair is completely separate from every other perception I receive of that chair. Every impression that I receive is completely separate from every other impression. But I have the concept and I have the experience, and my picture of the world is that it is the same chair. So this is where it slips through your fingers a little bit sometimes, because in fact this is completely different to the way a machine, in a sense, perceives the world or receives impulse. The machine receives impulses, they are not connected in any way. It's simply hardwired to deal with each impulse and do something with it. Compare it to previous impulses, fine, but it doesn't have the concept that it's dealing with the same object. Whereas if you accept, as Richard Dawkins does, that a bat pictures the world in a very similar way to human beings, the way that human beings picture the world, then first of all, the bat must have a concept that it is at certain times perceiving the same object. It must have the concept first that it's the same object, and this is not something a machine does. Now of course human beings we have a concept, we have a picture of the world, we have all these concepts, of the stability of the world and the continuity of objects in the world. This does not come from perception. And this is a very important realization, that our picture of the world, the subjective picture of the world, does not come from perception. It has to start with a concept, the concept that there are objects in the world, and the perception of a particular object. When we receive separate perceptions, this is what I'm trying to say, when we receive impulses telling us that we've perceived an object, and then we've perceived an object, and then we've perceived an object, we have to have the concept first that it is the same object, or could be the same object. So once you have a subjectivity, you have to have first concepts and then perception. Now, this is obviously completely different from a machine, and of course this is not, because this is quite a subtle topic, this is not something that Richard Dawkins deals with in terms of evolution, because evolution is a very clumsy and incorrect, in my opinion. I differ from Richard Dawkins here, but it's incorrect in my opinion, but it's a very clumsy way of explaining origins. So in terms of our work with Gurdjieff and Ouspensky, man is a machine, then there are two more laws. First of all, a machine does not have subjectivity. It does not make a picture of the world. And the second law is that if you're going to make a picture of the world, if you're going to have a subjective view of the world, a subjective picture of the world, you have to have first concepts and then perceptions. And this is not something a machine has. And equally, it's not something that is accounted for in terms of evolution, like so many other things. So have I answered your question there?